Hi class. I made a video for our presentation. Uh, if I do end up showing this, this is my funeral, but whatever. Uh, Colonial America intro, go Burr. In colonial America, there was 13 different colonies. We normally divide those 13 different colonies into 3 separate regions: the New England regions, the Middle regions, and the Southern region. All of them had different geography and their own separate challenges. They all made money in different ways, but they all eventually came together to form America as we know it today. I will be going over each of those different colonies and regions and the colonies inside of them, and what problems they faced, how they made their money and what their economic status was, how they interacted with Native Americans, the geography of their land, what religions they followed, and the experience that Africans had to go through in that day and age. Starting off with the New England regions. In the New England regions, there was 4 colonies: New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. So, as a note, these images don't show the correct locations. Like, they might have, like, an example, the previous one showed Maine, and the middle colonies, it shows Maryland, despite being in the southern regions. So there isn't much that I can say, so sorry. Now, they all had most of the same problems, along with some of the other colonies. But I would say that, in my opinion, they had the worst out of all. So, their problems ranged from harsh winters to famine and illness, and I say they have the worst because they have horrible geography. The main problem with the New England colonies is that their land was infertile, and they had really bad winters. Now, really bad winters were a huge problem in the colonial days because they didn't have things like heaters or heavy clothing. So that means if you're a new colony trying to live and survive, that lack of proper heat and horrible winters, as well as a lack of efficient ways to get food, would be a horrible combination to try to start a colony. So, like many of the other regions, they struggled with famine and illness. Famine, even if you have really fertile soil, you can still be prone to famine and illness. And especially going into the New World, illness was one of the most common ways that people were dying, apart from everything else. So all of these things combined made it a pretty harsh upbringing for the New England colonies. Moving on to their economy. The New England region, most of their economy was based off of wood. The reason why is because they didn't have any rich, fertile soil to base their economy off of, unlike the middle and southern colonies. So they instead had to use the lush forest that they had in their surrounding area to base their economy off of. So they would sell the lumber, they would make boats, and they actually became a port city. And so they traded in and sold resources that way, and that's how they made most of their money. So their economy was mostly made up of reselling wood or boats or fish and becoming a port city. So there's not much to say. Moving on to their relationship with the Native Americans. Overall, they had a relationship with the Native Americans. There's not much to say. In the beginning, they traded with them, but they still had their own issues. They fought from them and stole from them, and killed most of them with illness. There isn't much to say. They started off trading with the Native Americans and eventually just stole their land, and killed everyone. Whether it be accidentally via new illnesses that they weren't immune to, or just killing everyone like Massachusetts did. when they went to war with them. Not much to say. Despite everything that I just said, there were actually positive relationships between the two, despite all the bad. Rhode Island was the land for Rhode Island was actually bought from the Native Americans. And before everything deteriorated, they did have a positive relationship with trading. But it is a shame that we America'd it, and that's what happens. Moving on. After that is their geography. It was mostly rocky land. If there was any flat land, it was mostly by the ocean, which is why it was good for ports, and it mostly became a port city. The rough land was infertile and hard to manage, making, as I said earlier, it really hard to grow food and survive off of it. But it did have a lot of dense forests, which allowed them to get a lot of lumber and use it to make boats and sell wood and etc. with wood. So, also, again, not much to say. Infertile soil, rocky land, good for ports. After that is the religion. Most of the people in the New England colonies were Puritans, which you may remember from the Salem witch trials. Puritans were people who followed the Bible word for word, and they traveled to the New World for religious freedom to get their radical Bible views. Religion was taken very seriously and was integrated into their education system and everything that they did. They had a sort of government-ish, where they had a meeting house where they held church, but it was also served as a courtroom of sorts. Overall, religion was a very close tie to their entire education system and everything that they did in the New England colonies. It was always taken with it. So again, not too much to say. Africans were, if you were free, you were still discriminated against and treated as less as human. If it was, even though it was quite uncommon for you to be a free African. Most people were enslaved and forced to do housework and hard labor, but there were actually hard-working jobs that African slaves did do, such as ministers, doctors, tradesmen, and merchants. Not all Africans were enslaved, some were actually choosing to work off debt by choice, and there was actually laws passed that were used to differentiate people who were enslaved and people who were working off debts. Overall, it was still harsh punishment, not good. Still horribly discriminated against. Not much else to say. With that, that concludes the New England colonies. Starting off with the middle regions, there was 4 colonies in the middle regions: New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. So, starting off with their problems, they were pretty much the same as the New England regions. They had harsh winters, and they did struggle with famine and illness, and they didn't have the best geography. Definitely wasn't as bad as the New England regions, but it was still bad. So, the harsh winters and the famine and the geography wasn't as bad as before, but there were still the same gist of problems that they faced. So, again, not much else to say. New illnesses in the New World causing lots of problems, especially because they didn't have vaccines or proper medication. Famine, just not having enough food to go around, and then harsh winters. It's cold, we don't have heat in that time, so pretty much the same problems. Not too much to say. After their problems is their economy. So most of their economy was based off of wheat and grains, and they were the most common type of resource that they sold. So because they didn't have horrible soil like the New England regions, they were able to capitalize off of that and still make their economy mostly based off of farming. But they didn't just farm, they also raised and sold livestock as well, as well as trading with Native Americans. So, I mean, they were able to sell wheat and grains and livestock, and as well as trading. So, not the best, not the worst. Not too much to say. After that is their experience with the Native Americans. So they did have in the beginning they did have a positive relationship. It was part of their economy to trade with them, and that's kind of how they got resources and extra money through trading. But eventually, it did kind of divulge into war and a lot of other problems. So we killed them and stole their land, and we pulled America. So, pretty much to sum it up, it was a good relationship that helped both parties out until we eventually got a little too greedy for ourselves and took over their land and fought them and eventually killed most of them that we already didn't kill via illnesses. It's kind of a trend that happens a lot, sadly. Yeah. After that is their geography. As I said before, they did have rich, fertile soil. It was mostly flat land with wide valleys, and it had a pretty good climate. It had a decently big growing season, so they were able to grow food for around half of the year and sell that food. So pretty good. Good soil for stuff. Definitely better than the New England regions. After that is their religion. It was mostly a melting pot of a bunch of different religions together. So the origin of most of the middle colonies was that they were formed by Quakers who wanted religious freedom that they didn't have in England. And so freedom of religion was a big point of everything in the middle regions. So it was the main part of their philosophy. And what religion didn't play quite as much as a role like it did in the New England regions, but it was still important, and so it was like a melting pot. So it was a bunch of different religions all kind of mishmatched together to become one. And it was very diverse. It's the most diverse out of all of the different regions, religiously, and what type of backgrounds people had. So, actually pretty interesting. And finally, with the middle colonies, we have the African experience. There were slaves, and most of the Quakers that were there believed that slavery was wrong and tried to stop it, and they were some of the first to make anti-slavery laws and try to abolish slavery, and they're known as the backbone for trying to abolish slavery. But sadly, not everyone in the middle regions was a Quaker, and therefore slavery was still rampant and still horrible. If you were free, you were discriminated against, and if you were a slave, you were discriminated against and treated horribly. You were treated horribly if you were free, too, actually. So just more saddening information about how horrible it was for Africans. And with that, it concludes the middle colonies. And moving on, we are now on to the final region, the southern regions. So, starting off, the colonies that were inside of the southern regions are Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Onto their problems, they pretty much had most of the same problems as everyone else. So, starting off, disease, mosquitoes were one of the common ways that people got diseases, and it was how most people died. It struggled with disease the most out of the three, I'd say. Harsh winters. They did have fertile soil, but winters were still a problem. Droughts, which you could see as a problem if your entire economy is based off of cash crops and plantations. Definitely a big problem. And social classes. Now, this isn't like a specifically obvious problem, like disease, this is how you died, but having most of your population be either enslaved or indentured people, mostly Africans who are kidnapped and taken there, who are poor, and if they are free, then they are trying to help other people, but how their entire social class and social economics worked could definitely be seen as a problem compared to other regions. How they had pretty well organized social classes. The southern regions are just completely messed up because of how their entire economy works. So, moving on. Not too much to say. After that, we have the economy. As I said, it is just cash crops and plantations. The southern region, mostly all of the colonies, had giant plantations where they had African slaves farm cash crops such as tobacco, cotton, etc. And that's what their entire economy was based off of. Almost all of their exports were cash crops. And this was pretty much because they had the best soil out of all the regions. It had a really good growing season almost the entire year, and flat land. So, with all that, it's really good for their economy. After that, we have their experience with the Native Americans. It's the same as everything else. They started off having a positive relationship, both sides benefited each other through trade, so eventually their relationship soured, and eventually just both sides didn't trust each other anymore, and eventually the colonies took over the Native Americans' land and killed them. Sad truth, but that's what just happens to all of them. Not much to say, sadly. After that, we have their geography. I touched on this a lot in their economy. It's just really fertile soil, almost the entire year of growing seasons. Really good for their economy. Flat land. Not too much to say. Moving forward. Now we are on their religion. Most of the people in the southern region were some branch of Christianity, so Evangelical, Baptist, Presbyterian, Catholic, etc. Religion didn't play as much as a role as it did in some of the others regions, and that's mostly due to because of how everything was set up. So plantations were far apart from each other, and so there wasn't, unlike the middle regions, there wasn't able to have the each religion kind of melt together like a melting pot, like it did in the middle regions, as I said. So it was all diverse religions, but they weren't together. They were apart. So that's really the easiest way that I can describe how religion took place in this part. And religion wasn't as high valued as it was in some of the other regions, but this is pretty much all I can say. It's complicated. I don't even understand it that well, to be honest. After that is the African experience, which actually ends this section. I don't think I need to say much here. In the southern regions, their entire economy was based off of plantations. plantations were run by the plantation manager, and they had African slaves and had them do all of the work, and were paid nothing and treated as less than human. There were indentured servants, both white and black, and they also helped work on plantations, but it was mostly enslaved Africans. You were discriminated against, treated horribly. Some people even refer to brutality of the witch hunts. Just how horrible and inhumane this treatment was to these poor Africans. And Africans made up most of the entire population of the southern regions. It's really sad still how horrible they were treated. All that being said, that does conclude this section and all three regions.